Daniel 5. So, as we come throughout this incredible book, and, you know, when I say incredible, I mean that and could be referring to so many different aspects about this book. But one that I will point out this morning is the fact that this book is written 500 years before the time of Christ. So roughly that's 2,500 years ago. And that this book is so applicable. I hope that's what's jumping out at you as we study through it this particular time. Is it speaks directly to issues that we're facing today. And so I think that is incredible and phenomenally encouraging aspect of this book by Daniel. Now, as we've stayed through Daniel, we've seen the image of mankind and what mankind is meant to be contrasted. The difference between the image of God that we were created in Genesis, the first chapter, what we are meant to be, versus what we become and how we rule one another. We were created in the image of God to have rule and dominion. There is rule and dominion in this earth, and it looks very different from what God's intent was. The role and dominion of this earthly, of individuals and of earthly groups is very different than what God would have us to be. So we see this idea of this image contrasted throughout the book. In chapter 4, the chapter that we finished last week, we've seen that leading up to this, that the governance, and really in chapter 7, we're going to really start to dig into this, but in prior chapters, we see that the image of man is more like a beast than like what God would have us to be. Rather than ascending to our purpose, we descend to be instinctual and primal, just like animals, serving our own interests and our own desires and instincts for that matter. Nebuchadnezzar made himself prideful. He was proud. What did God do to him? Brought him low, exactly. And he did it in such a way that that image is meant to stand out to us. He made him like an animal. Nebuchadnezzar, you're acting like an animal. You know, we say this around the house periodically. Were you born in a barn? You see, we don't say that in our household. I'll tell you why. The biggest problem we have in our household, the Graffs point this out to me all the time. They say our house is like a beacon. There's always lights on, and we're kind of like a lighthouse because we joke that like twice ever that we came home and the attic lights were turned off. Evie rejoiced, and she's like, yay, look, I turned my lights off. Like I'm not sure twice in 5 years is a cause for celebration. But the point is that we say, are you born in a barn? I don't ask that because we had boarding stable, and we had in our boarding stable probably 70 or 80 lights, and we had boarders, and it amazed me how many of those lights someone could come in to see one horse, and they'd go all through the barn 10 minutes turning light switches on. This thing would glow, and then they'd leave and go home, and it glows. So I'm certain my children were born in a barn. That's the exact behavior they exhibit at home. But I digress. The point is that Nebuchadnezzar, God makes Nebuchadnezzar to be like he was, right? At the end, though, there was a time put on it. For how long was Nebuchadnezzar going to be and was like an animal? That's an interesting phraseology. Until he repented, then she follows it up, or turned to God. What expressly was said, until you know I, God, am in charge of kingdoms, and I put who I want in charge. It's me that's doing this, right? And if you want to reference that, that's verse 17 of chapter 4. But Amanda's getting at this point that we kind of examined at the end of the class last week. Was Nebuchadnezzar converted? And it seems to me that he was. It was brought up last week that we don't see he's converted to Judaism, but he's converted to God, right? And there's some thought to put into what salvation is throughout that time, throughout any time. And we see Nebuchadnezzar acknowledging God for what he is and publicly declaring that to his entire kingdom. That is nothing short of absolute amazement. Just kind of a glance ahead, as you read throughout the book of Acts, you start to read about these devout individuals. Like Cornelius is just one example, that were not Jewish and yet were righteous individuals, devout individuals that seem to know God. And there's always so much speculation about how that happens. In my mind, you're seeing one aspect of that in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, where he's making this tremendous statement. So I want to anchor that in the contrast between chapter 4 and chapter 5. In both cases, God demands humility, submitting to him by these rulers, by these kings. And Belshazzar does not do that in chapter 5. He goes the opposite direction. So, a couple of preliminary things before we get into the details of chapter 5. Number 1, Belshazzar's father is who? Does anyone know? Verse 2. Nebuchadnezzar. Good job, Shirley, but that was a trap. But you read it exactly perfect. This is worth noting because there are some difficulties both with Belshazzar and Darius. Belshazzar being the primary subject of chapter 5 and Darius just being mentioned in the very last verse, verse 35. We'll get to that in a bit. Here's what's important to know. The word interpreted father in our translations have no less than 7 different meanings. What seems certain from historical evidences, and this has been a big critique of the book of Daniel throughout the years, is that Belshazzar is not Nebuchadnezzar's son. Okay? But Shirley, you were not wrong because you read exactly in there. But it is worth noting that that word we're interpreting father has many, many different meanings. One of them is predecessor, right? So Nebuchadnezzar was certainly Belshazzar's predecessor. In fact, there are 4 kings after Nebuchadnezzar and down to Belshazzar. For years, there was no historical evidence other than scripture to support that Belshazzar even lived. And then all of a sudden, we start digging up, not that long ago, within the last 5 decades anyhow, start digging up, archaeologists do, these cylinders and tablets that have Belshazzar's name. Here's what I think takes place from my limited understanding of this historical evidence. The last king of Babylon is Nabonidus. I practiced that. Nabonidus is the last historical king. And so there was, like I said, this critique that Daniel's is false. It doesn't apply. Here's what evidence since has shown. Nabonidus was the last king of Israel. It's probable that Belshazzar is his son. Nabonidus spends the last number of years of his reign in Arabia. And it seems as though he gives Belshazzar reign of the kingdom. While he's not the emperor, he is acting king during these last number of years. And hence the one that Daniel has interactions with. Is that clear? Or does that make sense? So Nabonidus is this last king of Babylon. He's out of town, right? And his son Belshazzar is acting king, ruling. That's going to be significant because he offers Daniel or anyone else who can interpret this third in command in the kingdom. Why would he offer third in command? Who's got second in command? Well, he's second in command, right? That's why he's offering the position of third in command to Daniel, as we'll see as we get into this study. Thirdly, the queen. I think we're going to see the queen step in and say, hey, you need to get a hold of Daniel. Many believe that this is the queen mother, although not the mother of Nabonidus, or not the mother of Belshazzar, but the queen or the wife of Nabonidus. In this time, understanding culture, this may seem a little bit weird to us, right? But it's a cultural thing. That what a king would do is he would marry the wives of the previous king because it gave him credibility as king, as having authority. This is why when Absalom has chased David out of the palace, what does he do? And he does this based on David's good friend and advisor. What horrific act does Absalom, perpetrate? He sets a tent up on the top of the palace and he sleeps with David's wives and concubines. Now, a horrific act, A, but B, it's easy for us to miss the cultural significance of that. He's laying authority. Now, we were talking about the image of man being degraded to beast. He's marking his territory. See how ridiculous it is? Right? And that's the exact point that we get down. So Nabonidus likely would have married a queen from Nebuchadnezzar. Now, there are, Nebuchadnezzar dies in 604 BC. Babylon is captured, in case you haven't caught on at the end of this chapter, that is what takes place. Babylon is captured in 538. So I had done the math on that. 62 years, right? 62 years. You say, well, how old is the mother queen? Well, bear in mind that she likely was a queen at the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign and likely rather young at that particular time, right? Questions or comments on that? That's kind of historical setting of where this chapter is. It's important to understand. Now, what we're going to see is in this chapter, there's this feast taking place. And the handwriting on the wall takes place during this feast. There are two marks of arrogance that Belshazzar, I think, takes. Number one's obvious. He's going to go get all the instruments that came out of the temple of God back in Jerusalem, and he's going to use them in a profane way to drink and get drunk out of. Right? That's obvious, right? We can see that. It's explicit. The other thing, the mark of arrogance that can be missed without knowing the historical setting, is during this feast, the Persians and the Medes are sieging the city. That's not expressly said in this chapter. In fact, Jeremiah 51 does give great detail of how this was. He predicted it in advance, how it was going to happen. But Daniel doesn't get into any of these details. All we see is the kingdom falls and Belshazzar is killed that very night. Think about the arrogance that while your enemy is sieging the city, you're having a big drunken party with 1,000 of the royal officers. Is he worried about the siege? No. Why would he not be worried about the siege? One answer I already gave you, arrogance, right? Now, what's the more practical reason? The more down to earth. Why would he not be worried with these armies outside? Okay. Yeah. It seems to have complete confidence that Babylon's going to win, right? Now, what's interesting is just prior to this, the Persians, primarily Persians, but Mede and Persians, are coming towards Babylon. The Babylonians go out and they fight them at the Battle of Opek. And Mede and Persia thoroughly thwomp Babylon. And the Babylonian soldiers run back into the city. And now we just got beat, and we're not worried. Why are we not worried? If you go back weeks ago to when we started to study, we talked a little bit about Babylon. These walls are impregnable. You can't get through them. No machinery of that day was going to get through those walls. We're safe. By the way, speaking of such matters, did you see the Titanic replica just took sail to take the same exact path of the original? I think it's safer now because we've melted all the icebergs. So, but speaking of things that can't be conquered or beat. So let me give you this little really neat tidbit of history, and then we'll go back. How does anyone know how the Medes and Persians got into the city then, if these walls were impenetrable? Anyone know? So, weeks ago, I told you that the Euphrates River ran right through Babylon. And they had gates, so there's these huge walls, 2 segments of walls. They had these gates where they could open and actually flood the moats. So the first wall was almost impenetrable for that time. But the idea was, if anyone got through that wall, when the enemy was in the trenches between the walls, you open the gates and you flood out the moat between, you kill all the soldiers, and then you have even a more imposing wall found there. So the Euphrates River runs right through amazing engineering. Here's what the Medes and Persians did. Everyone runs to the city. They very ingeniously start to act like they're digging in earthen trenches, kind of like World War I, but much bigger. And the Babylonian assumption would have been that they're going to get in these trenches and then start launching things at the wall to overcome the wall. What they did is they diverted the Euphrates River. And then the soldiers entered the river and walked, most believe, knee, ankle deep water right under the wall of Babylon. Right in. The whole city's in this amazing feast. Persian accounts say they didn't have to fight. Other accounts say it's a little bit bloody. I think putting the two together, there's, relatively speaking, for the fall of this great city, there's no fighting. They just march in, a little bit of defenses, kill Belshazzar, and the city is theirs. Amazing. With that in mind, I encourage you in your time, read Jeremiah 51, starting in verse 24 in particular. It's an amazing prediction many years before it actually happened. Questions or comments on that? Okay, so that's what's going on all around this chapter. With that in mind, then, would someone read 1 through 4 of chapter 5?
King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of 1,000. Belshazzar, when he had tasted the wines, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem. He brought that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the kings and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and gold, wood and stone.
Thank you. So what we see happen here is they're having this huge feast. And at some point throughout the feast, as the wine is taking effect, Belshazzar decides to go get the elements of the temple of God. Why is that significant? We'll see a little bit later. The Queen Mother speaks to Belshazzar like he should know about Daniel. The stories of Nebuchadnezzar are still alive. And it would seem as though implied is that's part of the motivation. So we go, and if you go back into Exodus, and especially Leviticus, you see these elements that he's using are phenomenally precious and high dollar items. And so what we're doing is we're using these instruments and praising the gods of gold as you're drinking out of the golden gauntlet or golden goblet. And praising the God of silver, praising the God of all these things, with the instruments that God had made for his disciples, or excuse me, his worship. So all the time we're counting on the walls that Nebuchadnezzar built to save us from the armies. Questions, comments? All right, would someone read 5 through 9, please?
And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed.
Thank you. So, and that word immediately is difficult here, right? And some of these time frame words, I think we misunderstand. For instance, the word eternal, we associate solely with time. But the word eternal in the Hebrew mind meant complete, entirely, to its finish. In the same way, we see the word used immediately here. It seems to mean suddenly and with great impact, out of nowhere, that this is taking place. Because we're in the middle of this feast, we've got these elements of the temple, and we're serving other gods with them, and all of a sudden this appears. And it appears in such a way that Belshazzar sees it clearly. He sees it clearly, but he understands it not at all, right? It's right there. And that is the interesting thing about the handwriting on the wall. It's clearly seen. But usually those who need to heed it most don't have any understanding whatsoever.
seen that finger come down and write on the wall, I think my color would change too if I seen a finger writing on the wall.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is obviously a sign from the supernatural, right? In his eye. We're going to say God. But in Belshazzar's eye, this is something bad. Immediately he has a bad feeling about it. I think I've shared this with you before. Amanda and I were in Bible study in Toronto with an individual one time. And we're in this little apartment, and he's this great, big, tall, broad individual. And we're studying with him, and he says to me, Mike, is God, and he spoke real slow and deliberately, is God ever spoke to you? And I asked him, I said, well, you mean audibly? Through his word or another way? No, I mean out loud. And I said, no, I can't say he has. And he says, good. He ever speaks to me in here, he's going to be in here by himself. And it was just a humorous moment in our study, but that would be alarming, right? You hear this voice, and that's the way Belshazzar is. He sees this, he knows it's out of his control. So he's alarmed. I noted before that in verse 7, he offers third in command. I think that's a pretty good clue there to some of the context that isn't directly mentioned in this chapter, that just recently archaeology seems to be pointing to and giving some amount of understanding to him. So he cries out. I mean, you see the terror even in his volume. He cries out for the wise men. Now, this is a theme we see over and over. This is no less than the third time that we've seen this in the book. Why are we calling out to these wise men to interpret this? And hence, why is Daniel recording that? That's an important question, right? There's all kinds of details not recorded. Why is that a detail that is preserved, is recorded for us? What's the point of that? Yeah. If you go back, Kevin says the wise men couldn't interpret it. And it's kind of simple, right? But if you go back to chapter 2, Daniel makes the point, and we're reiterating it throughout the book, no man can do this. Daniel's saying, even I can't do it, except God. That's Daniel's message, right? That no one can do that. So we're emphasizing that as we go through. So verse 10 through 12, if someone read that, we'll see the queen enter.
Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Forasmuch as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation.
Okay, thank you. So again, verse 10, that word queen, she may have been the acting queen, the wife of Nabonidus that we spoke of earlier, or she may be the queen mother. Just like the word father, the word used for queen has several meanings here, and our interpretation makes it a little overly simplistic. So we can miss some some of that. So notice also that the wives and concubines in verse 2 are already at the party. She's entering. She's here. And we tend to read this because it takes moments to read through, as long as I'm not talking in between, right? It takes moments to read through, and we see it happening very quickly. This is a prolonged period of terror for Belshazzar because he sees it, he calls out, now we're parading all these wise men through, and they can't answer. And now the queen is entering. She's heard the turmoil. She's heard, it would seem, that there is distress. And so she comes in and she says, listen, there's this man that had a great relationship with Nebuchadnezzar, your predecessor, and he's the one you need to talk to. He's the one that you need to see. Now, an interesting point in verse 12, difficult sentences, I think, Kevin's what King James read. The ESV reads, solve problems, that he's able to solve problems. It's interesting, the literal interpretation of this is naughty problems. Naughty problems, not naughty like a child is naughty. Naughty as in Knotty, knots. Problems that are all knotted together, right? Daniel is presented as the one who can untangle the mess. And that's what he's brought forward to do. Questions or comments? Would someone read 13 through 16, please?
Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought you from Judah? I have heard of you, and the spirits of the God is in you, and that the light and the understanding and the excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men and the enchanters had been brought in before me to read the writing, and they knew to me it is interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make it known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple, have a chain of gold around your neck, and you shall be third ruler in the kingdom.
Thank you. So this same promise was made to the enchanters. None could fulfill it. He brings Daniel in. I've heard about you. You do amazing things. I'm going to give you fine clothes, a big gold chain, and be third in the kingdom. Questions or comments? I'm going to read here verse 17. And Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards for another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. I want to pause there because this is so important. Many read that as sarcastic, as demeaning to the king. In fact, I've read it that way. Keep your gifts. I don't want your gifts. Studying through this time, I see this a little bit differently because that's completely different than how Daniel's dealt with these kings all through, and I think is contrary to the overall purpose of the entire book that we've seen. I think what Daniel's saying, if I understand it properly at this point, is, listen, I'm going to speak the truth regardless. I don't need your money, and I'm not like your wise men who will tell you what you want to hear because you pay them well. I'm going to speak the truth regardless. Daniel is not being degrading, I don't believe. Furthermore, we talked at the beginning of this study, Daniel knows the armies are outside. Everyone knows the armies are right outside the gates. Daniel can look and see the meaning of this, and Daniel knows he's not going to be able to fulfill what he says. His promises are useless. He's a dead man. I think Daniel sees exactly that in this response. Questions or comments on Daniel's response? We're getting close. We're almost. Verse 22 is going to be the thesis of this chapter. Verse 18, O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty, and because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive, and whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought before him, that brought from the kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of the beast, and his dwelling was that of the donkeys, and was fed the grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he wills. We'll pause there before we read 22. Daniel says, Nebuchadnezzar, your predecessor, was put in charge by who? What did he tell him? Very begin, verse 18. God, the Most High God. And he acted as though he could do whatever he wanted to do. And he exalted himself until God ripped it from him and cast him out like an animal. Now, he speaks to Belshazzar like he should know this. Why should Belshazzar know about these events? It's an important part of this book that can be missed if we just read through it without noticing context. He should know it because chapter 4 was a public decree by Nebuchadnezzar that he made open to the whole kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar told the whole world what had happened. It's part of public record at this point. And Daniel's saying to Belshazzar, you should have known this. Now, verse 22, this is the point of the chapter. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. Right? That's the point of the chapter. It's the point of chapter 5. Continuing on with verse 23. But you've lifted up yourself against the Lord of heavens, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised. This is another big part of the chapter. And you have praised the gods of silver, of gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, nor hear, nor know. But the God in whose hand your breath, in whose all your ways you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and the writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, Persian. Did I say that right? Kevin says, yeah. These words are very close to the Persian, Aramaic words that Daniel ascribes them to. So it seems as though the handwriting was a bit of a riddle. Mene, M-E-N-E, sounds very much like the Arabic word that means to count or to measure. And Daniel plays off that. The next word, tekel, means very close to has been weighed. And the last word is very close to the Aramaic word of being divided. And so Daniel says, verse 26, this is interpretation of the matter, meaning God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You're done. Verse 27, tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and been found wanting. Doesn't sound good. Verse 23, peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Remember, the Mede and Persian allies are right outside. It's interesting that Persia becomes the dominant force in a little bit of time, and Paris seems like it's alluding to that as well in this division. 29, Belshazzar gave the command. Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put on his neck, and proclamation was made about him that he should be third ruler in the kingdom. For how long? Just a couple hours. Verse 30, that very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Darius seems to be a governor that Cyrus the king, the Persian king, puts in control of Babylon. We talked about how that took place, how he was killed that very night. This is the last day of the Babylonian Empire. Questions or comments? Thank you for your time.